The phone on the kitchen table rang 4 times before anyone picked it up. Nora Halstead stood at the window and watched the attorney's sedan idle at the end of the drive, its exhaust curling white in the cold February air. She did not go to the door. She was watching the dog. The German shepherd sat perfectly still at the edge of the porch, not 50 feet from the sedan. His ears were up. His tail was down. He had not moved in nearly 3 minutes, and in the 14 months since Garrett Pruitt had first brought him home from the trainer in Bozeman, Nora had learned that stillness like that was never peaceful. It was something else entirely. Her brother Clint was already at the front door, already pulling it open, already smiling the smooth retail smile he wore whenever money was involved, which lately was always. He called something back toward the kitchen. She didn't answer. The dog's name was Colt, and Colt had not decided yet whether the man getting out of that car was safe. If you've ever watched a good dog hold that kind of judgment over a stranger, you already know what it means. Stay close to the story. What happens next will matter. The attorney's name was Gerald Fenn, and he had driven 3 hours from Missoula to deliver news that nobody in the Pruitt family had expected. Garrett Pruitt, 78 years old, had died on a Thursday morning in late January without once telling his children what he had written in the final amendment to his will. He had been their father for 43 years. He had been a cattle rancher for 51. And in the last document he ever signed, he had named someone neither of his children had ever met. Clint Pruitt was 39. He stood 6 feet even, a little soft around the jaw, with sand-colored hair cut close and the kind of even tan that came from standing outside at job sites rather than from actual labor. He sold agricultural equipment out of Billings and made decent money at it. And he had spent the months of his father's decline calculating, as precisely as he could, what the Pruitt ranch would be worth once the old man died. He had a figure in his head. It was a good figure. Nora Pruitt was 34. She was shorter than her brother and built more like their father, wide through the shoulders. With dark hair she kept pulled back and her father's same flat, unhurried way of reading a room before she committed to anything. She had stayed on the ranch through her 20s, while Clint built his career in the city, and she had driven her father to dialysis appointments in Billings every Tuesday and Friday for the last 2 years of his life. She was not calculating the ranch's value. She was thinking about the dog. Colt moved off the porch as the attorney climbed the front steps. He did not block the man. He simply repositioned, putting himself between Fenn and the door, and sat again. His dark almond eyes tracked the briefcase. Gerald Fenn paused at the top step and looked down at the dog. "That's fine," Nora said from inside the screen. "He's reading you. Just don't reach fast." Fenn nodded and reached slowly for the door handle instead. Colt did not growl. He stepped aside. Nora filed that away. They sat at the kitchen table, all 3 of them, with Colt settled on the floor to Nora's left, his chin on his forepaws but his eyes still open. Fenn set the briefcase flat, opened it, and produced a manila folder with the clean, bureaucratic efficiency of someone who had delivered uncomfortable news before and knew that no amount of preamble made it easier. "Your father executed a codicil to his will on November 4th of last year," Fenn said. "That's approximately 11 weeks before he passed. The amendment is valid and properly witnessed. I want you both to understand that before I read it." Clint's hands were flat on the table. "What kind of amendment?" "He named a 3rd beneficiary. Specifically, your father named a man called Declan Marsh as an equal co-inheritor of the ranch property, including all structures, water rights, and mineral leases, alongside the 2 of you." The room went quiet enough that Nora could hear the refrigerator cycling. Colt lifted his head. Who? Clint said. Fenn slid a page across the table. Declan Marsh, a veteran. Your father's language in the codicil indicates the man served in the Marine Corps. Beyond that, I have only the name and a post office box in Hardin, Montana, which may or may not still be current. Your father left no explanatory letter. Clint sat back hard in his chair. Our father left a third of this property to somebody we have never heard of. He left the property equally to 3 named parties. Yes. Nora pulled the page toward her and read it. Then she read it again. She looked at the date, November 4th. She tried to remember what her father had been doing in November. He had still been mobile then, mostly. He had been quieter than usual, but she had thought that was the dialysis fatigue, the way the treatment hollowed him out for 2 days afterward. She tried to remember if he had said anything about a man named Declan. Nothing came. We're contesting it, Clint said. Fenn's expression did not change. That is certainly your right. Nora set the page down and looked at the dog. Colt was watching the attorney again with that same still watchfulness. Not threatening, just measuring. She thought about what that usually meant. The weeks that followed were not gentle ones. Clint hired an attorney of his own, a firm out of Billings that specialized in estate disputes, and the paperwork began to accumulate on the kitchen table in stacks that Nora moved each evening to make room for supper. Clint drove out from Billings on weekends, and he and Nora ate their father's food from the freezer and argued in the polite, precise way that siblings argue when the stakes are high enough that they are both afraid to say the actual thing they mean. Clint's position was that a man in declining health, on dialysis and pain medication, could not be presumed of sound mind when he added a stranger to his will 11 weeks before dying. Nora's position was harder to articulate. She wasn't sure she disagreed with her brother. She wasn't sure she agreed either. What she kept coming back to was the fact that their father had been, in her experience, one of the least impulsive human beings she had ever known. Garrett had taken 3 years to decide to buy the property adjacent to their northeast fence line. He did not do things accidentally. She drove to the county clerk's office in Crow Agency on a Wednesday morning and asked to pull anything on file under the name Declan. The clerk, a compact woman in her 50s named Ruth Beartooth, searched the system and came back with a single property tax record from 6 years prior, a leased parcel the man had maintained for 2 grazing seasons before the lease expired. The address of record matched the Hardin P.O. box Fenn had provided. You know anything else about him? Nora asked. Ruth Beartooth studied her for a moment. Saw him in here once, maybe 7 years back. Marine. Had the bearing. Came in with a dog. Nora drove back to the ranch in the thin February cold, the heater in her truck working hard against the wind off the Bighorn Range. Colt sat in the passenger seat and watched the road with her. She wrote a letter that evening to the Hardin P.O. box. She sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote 2 drafts before settling on one that said what she meant without saying more than that. She told the man who was apparently her father's mysterious beneficiary that she was Garrett's daughter, that her father had recently passed, and that she thought they should talk before lawyers made any more decisions for them. She signed it with her full name and the ranch address and a phone number, sealed the envelope, and set it on the counter. She did not mention her brother's lawsuit. She mailed it the next morning from the post office in Hardin. The letter came back 9 days later, unopened, marked, "Return to sender, box closed." Clint had been right about one thing at least. The man was hard to find. It was Nora who found him, though not by looking. She was at the grain co-op in Hardin on a Friday in early March, a gray morning with low clouds sitting on the Bighorn foothills and the temperature hovering just above freezing. She had been loading 50-pound feed sacks into the bed of the truck, working alone the way she had been working for the past month, counting out the loads in her head and thinking about the irrigation repair and not thinking about the legal papers and then thinking about them anyway. She had 3 sacks loaded when Colt went rigid beside her. Not a growl, no vocalization at all. Just that absolute stillness, ears fully forward, attention locked on a point behind her. She straightened and turned. A man was standing at the far end of the parking lot, leaning against a dark green pickup truck that had seen hard years and several winters. He was tall, somewhere in his early 40s, with a close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that needed another day of shaving. He wore a canvas work jacket over dark canvas pants and a pair of worn lace-up boots that had been resoled at least once. His hands were tucked into his pockets, and he was watching Colt the same way Colt was watching him, with a stillness that matched the dog's and a face that gave nothing away. Then Colt did something Nora had not seen him do with a stranger in the 14 months since Garrett brought him home. He walked toward the man. Not fast, not with any urgency. He simply moved forward 3 steps, then sat, and tilted his head slightly to one side. The man crouched, slowly, and let the back of one hand fall toward Colt's nose. Colt sniffed it. Then Colt pressed the top of his head against the man's forearm. Nora stood with a 50-pound feed sack in her arms and watched this happen. The man looked up at her. "You're a Pruitt," he said. It wasn't a question. She set the sack down. "Nora," she said. "You're Marsh?" He stood up. "Declan." He looked at Colt, who had not moved from the spot. "Your father called him Colt." "He did." Declan looked out at the road for a moment, the way a person looks at something they've been thinking about for a long time. "I should have gotten here sooner," he said. "I didn't know he was gone until 3 weeks after. I was out of range." "Out of range where?" "Up near the Canadian line. I do seasonal work." He looked back at her. "I'm not here for the land." Nora studied him the way she studied most things, carefully and without haste. "Then why did he give it to you?" He didn't answer right away. Colt sat between them like a mutual agreement. "Could we get some coffee somewhere?" Declan said. "This is going to take a minute to explain." They sat in a booth at a diner on the north end of Hardin, a place called Pella's, with a counter that had been there since the 70s and coffee that tasted like it too. Colt lay under the table. The waitress, a broad-armed woman named Connie, who wore her gray hair in a tight braid, brought water without being asked and left them alone. Declan wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table for a moment before he began. He had served 2 tours in Helmand Province, he said. He had come back to Montana because there wasn't anywhere else that felt like it made sense, and for a few years he had drifted between seasonal jobs, fencing crews, equipment work on drilling sites, occasional guided hunts. He had leased a small parcel east of the Pruitt ranch line 6 years back, run a few head of cattle on it to keep himself grounded. That was how he had met Garrett. He came out to fix a section of fence, Declan said. That was technically on his side, but that I'd been using as a windbreak. He was 72, 3 years before the dialysis started. He fixed the fence himself, brought the post driver in his truck and everything. I offered to pay him for the materials, and he told me to stop talking and hand him the staple gun. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "We spent most of that day on that fence," he said. He talked about the ranch. I talked about Helmand. He didn't ask me to explain anything I didn't want to explain, and I did the same for him. By the time we were done, he had invited me to supper. He had stayed a few days that first visit. He had come back a handful of times over the years that followed, whenever the seasonal work brought him back to that part of the state. Garrett had never told his children about those visits. Not because he was hiding anything, Declan thought, but because Garrett was not a man who explained his friendships. He simply had them. He called me once from the hospital, Declan said. That was November. He said he wanted to give me some land. I told him that wasn't necessary. He told me he hadn't asked my opinion. Nora turned her coffee cup in a slow half-circle. He would say that. I know. I should have argued harder, but he was sick and he didn't have much patience left for arguments, and I didn't want to spend one of his last phone calls fighting over something I could sort out after. After he was gone. He met her eyes. I'm not here to take anything from you. I didn't know there was a dispute. I'll sign whatever paperwork releases my portion, if that's what needs to happen. Under the table, Colt shifted his weight and lay his head on Declan's boot. Nora watched that happen and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, My brother has already filed a contest on the whole codicil. If the codicil goes, you don't have anything to release. Declan nodded slowly. Is that what you want? She thought about her father fixing a stranger's fence in July heat, because it needed fixing and because he was the kind of man who showed up to do things that needed doing. She thought about that phone call from the hospital, the one she had heard about secondhand just now, and tried to reconcile it with the version of November she had lived through herself. The quiet evenings, the dialysis fatigue, the way he had sometimes sat in his chair and looked out at the south pasture with an expression she had not fully understood. I don't know yet, she said. I want to know who you are first. They talked for 2 hours. Connie refilled their coffee 3 times and once brought Colt a piece of roast beef wrapped in a paper napkin without anyone asking, setting it on the floor with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made that calculation before. Colt ate it with dignified gratitude. By the time they walked out to the parking lot, Nora had a clearer picture. Declan was not a man who needed or wanted her father's land. He had been living out of the same truck for the better part of 3 years, moving with the work, carrying what he needed and leaving what he didn't. He had the unsettled quality of someone who had been in motion for so long that stillness had started to feel like a warning sign. She had seen that quality in other veterans she had known. She recognized it the way you recognize a weather pattern you've lived through before. What she did not expect was what he said as she was getting into her truck. He talked about you, Declan said. Garrett. When he called in November, he talked about you specifically. She looked at him across the hood of the truck. What did he say? Declan was quiet for a moment. With Colt sitting at his side now, the two of them framed against the pale March sky. He said you were the one who stayed. He said that meant something to him that he'd never found the right way to tell you. She got in the truck. She sat for a minute before she started it. Then she drove home and sat at the kitchen table where the legal papers were stacked and thought for a long time about her father fixing a stranger's fence in the July heat because it needed to be done. Clint came out the following Saturday, and she told him about Declan. Her brother listened, with his arms crossed, and the expression he always wore when processing information he didn't like. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said that the fact the man had renounced any interest in the property made the whole question moot. They could proceed with the contest, the codicil would be voided, and the estate would pass to the two of them in equal shares as the original will provide it. He said he'd sign a release, Nora said. That's not the same as the codicil being voided. Either way, we get the ranch. Either way, she said carefully, we end up with something Dad didn't want. Clint's jaw tightened. Dad wasn't himself in November. You know that. I know he was tired. I'm not sure that's the same thing. He added a stranger to his will, Nora. He fixed a stranger's fence at 72 because it needed fixing. She looked at her brother. That's not nothing. That's who he was. Clint left before supper. They did not argue exactly, but the distance between them at the end of that day was wider than when he had arrived. The following week, Nora drove out to look at the fence line where Garrett had spent that July day with Declan. She knew the section, the northeast corner where the old property had briefly been leased, 3 miles of wire strung along a draw that filled with snowmelt every spring. The repair was still holding, she could tell, even after 6 years. The posts were sunk right and the wire ran tight, the work of someone who understood that a fence built properly the first time saved you 10 repairs later. Her father had built things that way. She called Declan that evening from the number he had written on a napkin at Pella's. He answered on the second ring. "I want to propose something," she said. "But you'd have to come out to the ranch to discuss it in person." He was quiet for a moment. "When?" "Sunday." He came. He arrived at 9 in the morning, with Colt meeting him at the end of the drive again, this time with the dog's tail moving in slow, easy sweeps, which told Nora more than any conversation could. She made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, the legal papers pushed to one side, and she laid out what she had been thinking. She told him she wasn't going to pursue the codicil contest. That was her decision to make unilaterally, since she and Clint were co-plaintiffs, and she could withdraw her participation. Without Nora's support, the contest would be difficult for Clint to sustain alone. Her share of the legal fees was roughly half the cost of the whole proceeding. She told him she didn't want him to sign a release either. He looked at her steadily. "My father named you for a reason," she said. "Maybe it was sentimental. Maybe it was practical. Maybe it was some combination of both. And maybe I'll never understand exactly what he was thinking. But he was a man who did things because they needed doing, and he had 6 years to change his mind about you, and he didn't. I'd rather honor that than unwind it." Declan set his coffee mug down. "That leaves your brother." "I know. He's going to fight this without you. He might. Or he might not, once he thinks it through." She looked at the papers, then back at him. "There's a third possibility I want to float. A practical one. The ranch needed work she hadn't been able to do alone. The barn roof had needed attention for 2 winters, and she'd patched it twice with materials that weren't meant to be permanent. The irrigation system on the south field had a section of pipe that had cracked in the freeze last November and hadn't been properly repaired. The herd was small, down to 32 head, since her father's health had prevented him from managing the breeding program through the fall, and 32 head on 400 acres was not a number that made the operation financially sound. She was not asking him to work for her. She was not offering him wages. What she was suggesting was that for the period of time it took to sort out the estate, he was a legal co-owner of this property, and she would appreciate it if the co-owner helped her get the roof fixed. Declan looked at her for a long moment, and she had the impression he was calculating something internal, some private ledger she couldn't see. Colt padded over and pressed his head against the man's knee. "I haven't been in one place for 3 years, Declan said. "I know," Nora said. He looked at the table. "What does the roof need?" He was still there at the end of March. The barn roof took 6 days, the 2 of them working from ladders in the cold mornings and down to the groundwork by mid-afternoon, when the temperature made the higher sections dangerous. They stripped the old, rolled roofing first, peeling back layer over layer to find where the water had been getting in, and found what Nora had suspected but not wanted to confirm, that the sheathing on the north slope had gone soft in a 6-foot section just below the ridge. Water damage that had been building for 2 winters. It needed new sheathing before the surface could go back on. Declan made the supply run to the hardware store in Hardin without being asked, came back with the right gauge of sheathing and a box of ring shank nails and a tube of roofing cement, and they worked through the repair in methodical sections, the two of them moving in the wordless coordination of people who understand that a job done properly requires attention rather than conversation. Colt stayed on the ground below and watched with his ears forward, occasionally repositioning as they moved across the roof, keeping them both in his field of view. On the 5th day, they put the final layer of rolled roofing down and sealed the ridge, and on the 6th day, Nora climbed up alone in the early morning and walked the whole surface in the low, flat light, checking the seams and found nothing wrong. She sat up there for a few minutes with the Bighorn Range in front of her, and the ranch laid out below, the cattle in the south pasture. Declan moving toward the barn with a cup of coffee, Colt trotting at his heel. She thought about her father, who had done this same check on this same roof. Then she came down and they had breakfast. In the evenings they ate at the kitchen table, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't. Colt slept near the wood stove after supper, and occasionally looked between them with a quiet satisfaction that Nora found herself having to suppress a smile at. She told Declan about her father's last 2 years, the dialysis routine, the way his energy had gradually narrowed and concentrated. The evenings he had spent looking at the south pasture. She told him about the framed photographs in the hallway, their mother who had died when Nora was 14, their grandfather who had built the original homestead structure that was now the back wall of the equipment shed. Declan listened the way her father had listened, without interrupting, without rushing toward conclusions. He told her, in pieces over several evenings, about the second tour. Not the operational parts, the between parts. The way time moved differently when you were responsible for other people's lives. The weight of that responsibility, and the strange emptiness when it was suddenly gone. He had come back to Montana because it was the only place where the size of the sky felt proportional to what he was carrying, and he had spent 3 years trying to put it down somewhere that felt right. It never quite worked, he said one evening, looking at the wood stove with Colt's chin on his shin. Because you kept moving, Nora said. Because I kept moving, he agreed. Clint called in early April. His attorney had advised him that without Nora's participation, the contest was unlikely to succeed, and that the cost of proceeding alone would be substantial, and the outcome uncertain. He was, in his brother's even, controlled voice, furious. He asked Nora what she thought she was doing. She told him she was honoring their father. Clint told her she was being naive, that she was being sentimental, that she was letting a stranger take advantage of her grief. She waited until he was finished. Then she said, "Come out to the ranch. Meet him. Make up your own mind." Another silence. Then, grudgingly, "When?" He came on a Saturday in mid-April, when the mud season was giving way to the first real green, and the Bighorn Range had lost most of its snow above the lower ridge lines. He drove up the gravel drive in his company pickup, and Colt met him at the edge of the yard, and Nora watched from the kitchen window to see what the dog would do. Colt walked toward him, sniffed, and then sat with his tail in slow motion. Not the reserved stillness he had given Fenn. Not the active welcoming he had given Declan. Something in between, which Nora decided was accurate. Declan was in the equipment shed, working on the irrigation line with a pipe wrench and a bucket of fittings. He came out when Nora called and stood in the yard with engine grease on his hands and that same still expression, and the two men looked at each other the way men do when they have already formed opinions based on second-hand information and are now recalibrating against the actual person. Clint was shorter than he expected, Declan thought. Declan was older than he expected, Clint thought. They shook hands. Clint looked at the grease on Declan's hand and then shook it anyway, which Nora noted. They ate lunch at the kitchen table, the three of them, and at first the conversation had the careful, overpronounced quality of people who know they are supposed to be in conflict but haven't yet agreed on the terms. Then Clint asked about the irrigation repair, and Declan explained the problem and the fix with the same direct economy he brought to everything. And somewhere in the explanation, the conversation became a conversation rather than a negotiation. After lunch, they walked the fence line together, the three of them plus Colt, along the northeast section where the old lease had run. The afternoon was cold but clear, the kind of April day that hadn't made up its mind yet, with warm sun cutting through, and a northwest wind reminding you it was still early. The pasture grass was new and thin, still pale at the roots, and the fence wire threw long shadows across it. Declan pointed out the repair he and Garrett had done 6 years earlier. It was a 40-foot section where the original cedar posts had gone soft at the ground line and been replaced with pressure-treated pine, the wire restrung and braced with a corner brace assembly that was still square and tight after 6 Montana winters. Clint walked the section once, running his hand along the top strand the way a rancher checks wire, feeling for give. He stopped at the end of the section. He stood there with his back to them for a moment, and Nora could see in the set of his shoulders something that was not anger anymore. "He built things right," Clint said. "He did," Declan said. Clint turned around. His face had changed in some way that was difficult to name. The controlled, executive expression, gone a little soft at the edges. "I used to come out here on summer breaks in high school," he said. "He'd put me on fence crew. I hated it. Thought it was beneath me." He looked at the wire. "He never said a word about that. Just kept putting me on fence crew." Declan said nothing. He understood the story. Clint looked at him. "I'm going to be honest. I don't know what to do with this." Nora said nothing. "He never mentioned you," Clint said to Declan. "Not once. Not in 6 years." Declan considered that for a moment. "He wasn't a man who explained his friendships," he said. "He just had them." Something settled in Clint's face. He looked out at the pasture, at the land that had been their father's before it was theirs. He stood there for a long moment with the April wind moving his jacket and Colt sitting at his feet, looking up at him with that patient, waiting attention the dog brought to moments that mattered. "The roof looks good," Clint finally said. "6-day job," Declan said. "Nora cut the angles right. That's what matters with a hip roof." Nora felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted there for weeks. She did not say anything. She let it be. Clint withdrew from the estate contest 4 days later. Fenn called to notify Nora and sounded mildly surprised, the way an attorney sounds when people resolve things without him. The estate took another 8 weeks to finalize, between appraisals and tax filings and the formal transfer documents that Fenn's office prepared. The three of them signed where they were told to sign, and the ranch passed to the three of them in equal shares, and on the afternoon the last document was recorded at the county clerk's office. Ruth looked at the names on the filing and looked at Nora across the counter. "Marsh," she said. "I remember him." "He's been fixing the Southfield irrigation," Nora said, "and the barn roof." Ruth nodded slowly, as if this made sense to her in some way that didn't require elaboration. Nora drove back to the ranch in the early June afternoon, the first real warmth of the year pressing down on the valley the pastures green and the Bighorn Range stripped down to bare rock above the tree line. She pulled in and sat for a moment before getting out of the truck. Declan was in the north pasture with the herd, moving along the fence line on foot with Colt at his side, checking the wire the way Garrett used to check it on summer evenings, one hand trailing along the top strand to feel for slack. He had built a small camp at the edge of the property, a wall tent set back in the cottonwoods near the creek, but he had taken most of his meals in the house for the last 6 weeks, and the camp had started to look less like a temporary arrangement and more like a habit he had not yet found a reason to break. She watched him work for a minute. He had not said he was staying. She had not asked. There was something she recognized in that arrangement, the same patience she had watched her father exercise with animals that needed time to trust a place before they committed to it. You didn't force it. You made the conditions right, and you waited. Her father had once spent 2 weeks simply leaving the gate open on a section of pasture, where he wanted to move a skittish young steer, letting the animal wander through on its own time, letting it understand there was nothing on the other side worth fearing. The steer eventually walked through on a Tuesday morning in October, and that was the end of it. Garrett never said a word about the strategy. He just let it work. Colt spotted her truck and broke from the fence line at a trot, then a run, reaching her in a loose, easy gallop, with his ears back and his tail in full motion, and she scratched him behind the ear and called across the pasture. "Documents file," she said. Declan lowered the fence wire and looked up at her across 200 yards of green pasture. He nodded once. She watched his hand settle back on the top strand of fence, running it forward along the wire the way her father used to, checking what was there, making sure what was supposed to hold was holding. Then she went inside and started supper. That evening they sat on the porch in the long June light, the sky still pale over the western ridgeline at 8 o'clock, and Colt lay between them with his tail sweeping a slow arc on the boards. The cattle were settled in the pasture below. The barn roof showed no gaps in the last light. The repair Declan had made to the irrigation line had held through the spring runoff without a problem, and the herd had gained weight steadily through May, which was the first time that number had moved in the right direction in 2 years. It was a quiet evening, the kind of quiet that has texture to it, that is made up of specific sounds rather than the absence of them. A meadowlark somewhere in the south pasture, the creak of the porch boards settling as the temperature dropped, the occasional low sound from the cattle below. Nora held her coffee mug with both hands and thought about the fact that she had lived on this property for 34 years, and that this was the first evening in a long time that the porch had felt the way it used to feel when her father sat here. She did not know exactly how to account for that. She suspected it had something to do with the fact that the work was caught up. "My father called you because you were someone he trusted," she said. Declan had a coffee mug in both hands and was looking at the ridge line. He didn't answer right away. "He trusted you because you showed up," she said. "To fix a fence. To sit with a sick man on the phone in November. Whatever else was between you that I don't know about." "That's about all of it," Declan said. "Then he left you land for the same reason he fixed yours," she said. "Because it needed doing, and he was the kind of man who did things that needed doing." Declan looked at his coffee for a moment. Colt lifted his head and rested it on the man's knee. "I don't know how long I'd planned to stay," Declan said. "When I drove down here in March. I know you didn't plan it. I was going to sign the release and leave. I know that too." He was quiet. The light was going off the ridgeline now, the sky deepening toward that particular shade of blue that only exists for about 20 minutes in the high country before dark arrives. "My father used to say," Nora said, that the reason some people couldn't stay anywhere was that they hadn't found anything worth the trouble of staying for yet. Declan looked out at the pasture, where the last of the light was lying flat and gold across the grass, and the cattle stood still and dark against it. He looked at the barn roof, solid now where it had been soft. He looked at the fence line, clean and right. He looked at Colt, who was looking back up at him with the same steady patience the dog applied to everything that mattered. He set his coffee mug on the porch rail. "I should probably move the camp down closer to the creek," he said. "Warmer there through July." Nora looked at the ridge. "Probably," she said, which was between two people who communicated mostly in understatement and physical action, more or less exactly what it sounded like. Colt settled back down with a long, slow exhale, his chin on his forepaws, his eyes open just enough to watch the last of the light go off the ridgeline. The cattle were quiet below. The barn held its solid shape against the darkening sky. Somewhere out near the creek, the cottonwoods moved in a breath of evening wind. Whatever Garrett had known when he picked up that phone in November, whatever calculation he had made in the quiet of a hospital room with the dialysis fatigue still on him, it had ended here, with supper cooling on the stove inside and the long day going dark around them, and a dog who had made up his mind about everybody months ago and had simply been waiting for the people to catch up. There are people in this world who show up not because anyone asked them to, but because something in them knows where they are needed. Your father might have been that kind of person. You might be that kind of person. And if you are, you already know the quiet relief of finally arriving somewhere and understanding, without anyone having to tell you, that this is the place. Stay in that place. Guard what's been given to you, and give what you can give in return. May God bless you and keep you, and may the people in your life know how to find their way home.